So, hi folks, welcome to TBRCon2022. This forum is Swordplay 101, and we're going to talk about swordplay and swordplay in writing. I'm Miles Cameron. I've written a bunch of books, which I will not bore you with now because I've promised not to talk too much. And I'm going to ask each person on the panel to introduce themselves. But first, because I like to talk, I'm going to talk about a sword. My sword is a 1760s British grenadier briquette. It's an officer's sword, and most fun, it was cut short for use in America. Yes, this short little punch him in the jaw with the hilt, very plain but very elegant sword, could stop a bayonet thrust, but also could be fenced with. I just love it. It's original. Okay, Lee, you're up.
Well, hi there. My name is Lee C. Conley, and I'm the author of the Dead Sagas. Now, I'm going to do it. I'm going to just show you. Here's one of my books.
Yes.
Here's another. I'm also the senior, one of the senior instructors at Wolf's Head Western Martial Arts in Lincoln in the UK as well. We primarily do longsword, and I do a mix of English combined with or alongside Italian and German. I'm also, I like to frequent the tournament scene as well, so I've got a couple of medals, which is quite nice. So I got 5 golds and a few other ones as well. But and I suppose that's why that puts me here. So thank you. It's nice to be here.
Alina.
Right. Yeah, I guess I'm up. I'm Alina Boyden, and I'm the author of Healing Thunder and Gifting Fire, which are out now. You can buy them anywhere you like. And they're Mughal Empire fantasy novels, essentially, which are really fun. And I'm here because I teach fencing in my spare time. So lately, I've mostly been teaching small sword, but I also have a lot of experience with Kunstfechten, which is the German longsword fencing system. Not just longsword, but a number of other weapons as well from the Middle Ages. And I've also done Japanese fencing. And in terms of the swords that I've brought for you today, I say swords, well, swords loosely. I have, just in honor of Healing Thunder and Gifting Fire, my really nice 18th century Mughal Qatar, which is a really fun punch dagger weapon. You can stab people with it, which is pretty great. And then I also have another stabby thing, which is an 18th century 1740s French small sword, which is I got from Maxime Chouinard in Canada, and it's also original to going to America. And if you look, you see the cut down briquette that Miles just showed us. The small swords oftentimes kept their hilts but had their blades changed out by officers to be something a little more robust for dealing with Native Americans and tomahawks. But this officer must have decided that he was fine with the smaller blades, so that's what it's got on it.
Anna.
Hi, my name is Anna Stevens. I am the author of the Goblin trilogy and the Songs of the Drowned trilogy, although only the first book of the Songs of the Drowned is out at the moment. I'm a karateka, and I also have trained in historical European martial arts. Shout out to Birmingham HEMA. Obviously, since COVID hit, there was everybody shut down, and through various reasons, I haven't managed to get back yet. I do promise I'm coming back, guys, because my sword of choice is my baby's first feather, which I haven't actually managed to fence with yet. I don't know whether you can see, but I had him named Trickster after the Fox God out of my debut trilogy. So yeah, I do definitely want to get back. And I do also, I don't know, you probably can't see it. That is the hilt of, yikes, a World War II katana that was seized by the Americans during the Pacific War. And if you actually draw it, you'll see that it's got about 8 inches of the original blade. And then when it was either stolen or surrendered to the Americans, they snapped the rest of the blade off, and it's just had a blank welded onto the end. And I just thought, it was genuinely, it was used during World War II, and it's a little piece of history. So that is the other sword that I have brought to Sword Show and Tell.
Thanks, Anna. Sebastien.
I'm Sebastien de Castell. I'm probably most known for the Greatcoats series of swashbuckling fantasy novels and the Spellsinger YA fantasy series. One of my latest books is this. It's called Tales of the Greatcoats. They're short swashbuckling stories, of which I think almost all of them have sword fights in them somewhere. I have no credible qualifications to write about sword fights. I used to fence with épée, which is like doing all the fencing that Christian does, only it's done like fast instead of super slow. I'm just testing Christian's commitment to moderation here. And I used to choreograph sword fights for the theater. So I come out of a somewhat different tradition. I did bring a little sword here, which I'm mostly showing just because it was a gift from my brother-in-law. And this is a 19th century dress sword. So this would be absolutely no good whatsoever in a real fight, much like myself. And but I thought it was kind of interesting to show that because I have another sword which I've shown before, so you have to go back and watch the other TBRCon from last year, which was a 1908 model, which was one of the last swords ever used in actual war in the West in World War I. And what's kind of just sort of interesting is that sword is so very, very plain, and this sword is so pretty. It's got lots of nice, emblazoning and all this kind of stuff going on. And so swords have always been, I think, or for a very long time, certainly in the West, both not simply, a tool of defense or of warfare, but also a way of expressing a certain amount of privilege and status. And so I just thought I'd mention that.
Lovely, Sebastien. I'm going to go back to Lee because I think Lee has a sword he'd like to show us.
I did. I totally forgot my sword show and tell, so I do apologize. But I do have I've got all my swords are just here, actually. But the one I'm going to show you is this one here, which is my 15th century. Well, it's not 15th century. It's a modern version, but it's a little bit longer than the average longsword. The style I fence, the English longsword, we usually use slightly longer swords. This one's about 136 centimeters of brutality, basically. We've actually got slightly longer quillions as well. If you look at Henry VIII's sword in Leeds Armories, he's got like 30 centimeter quillions. So ours are a little bit longer as well. But this one was made in Hungary for me, and it's absolutely lovely. I won a few tournaments with this one, and I hit a lot of people with it. So it's my favorite sword. Yeah, that's my show and tell sword. Thank you very much.
Well done, Lee. So now that we've played show and tell, we're actually going to do the panel. So we have a bunch of questions to get through, and here we go. And I'm going to start with Anna Stevens. What's the purpose of a sword fight?
The purpose of a sword fight is to kill your enemy. If we are discussing sword fights in writing, however, I would say that the purpose of any sort of combat scene in your novel is to do three things. The first one is it needs to further the plot. As fun and pretty and flashy and gory as it is, it does need to actually bear some sort of relevance to the plot. It can be nice to, it can act as sort of a visual action scene that basically sums up either your plot or a particular part of your plot. So it can become like a visual representation of the opposing factions in your novel. But I also think one of the most important things is that any action scene, that particularly one that features a protagonist or a point of view character, it needs to deepen characterization. So it doesn't, I always say, and I know I'm not the only one, but I always say that writing a fight scene is like writing a sex scene. There are bodies moving in space, shall we say. In some instances, the outcome is very pleasurable. In other instances, less so. But the point is, it's about emotion and intention and the choices that your character makes at any given moment. And I like doing fight scenes because your characters are given the chance to be heroes and villains and cowards all at the same time. And it can be really nice to play with reader expectations by making your extremely good, noble character do something absolutely reprehensible in the heat of battle, because it then just shows a completely different facet of their character. So those
Thanks,
are my...
Anna. That's Sebastien.
Well, I'm going to modify something Anna said, which is that I think the purpose of a sword fight in real life is to gain advantage, and sometimes advantage is surviving versus not surviving, which is typically advantageous. But sword fighting has been used for such a wide variety of means over the centuries. I've been doing a tiny bit of research recently into sort of later period dueling, and I sometimes tell the story of oh God, I've forgotten her name, so I won't say it. An 1850s actress. Someone here will remember her name.
Jabarina?
Yeah, like
Sarah Bernhardt?
Not Sarah Bernhardt. La Jaguarina was the stage name. Who was sort of failing as an actress, became a kind of a legendary exhibiting duelist, and would sort of go to towns and put out these massive ads and offer to pay money to anyone who could defeat her, and was without doubt one of the most remarkable sword fighters of her day. Fought horseback, fought with knives, fought whatever you want. And she had studied under a guy named Colonel Monstery, who was more famous at the time and less so now, who was sort of a soldier of fortune and sword master type guy. So when I'm writing a sword fight, I'm always sort of looking for, in part, when we think of stakes, because of course there's always the very personal stakes. Once the blades start moving, everything goes out the wind, other than the desperate personal sense of survival. But why are they there is the part that's kind of interesting to me, and that's the part that I have to figure out how to play out in the scene itself. In other words, if the stakes are about two competing nations and this is somehow going to affect the outcome of a war, how is that playing out inside of the sword fight itself? Or if it's something else like dueling for money, how do the questions, the human sort of moral questions, if you will, that arise out of the notion of dueling for money, how does that play out in the swords as well? So I 100% agree with Anna. It starts from character, and who are they, and why are they doing, and why are they doing it, and then I sort of look for how do I use the fight itself as a little bit of a microcosm and a metaphor for the broader story.
Sebastien, how did you get through all of that without once slagging knights? Anyway, don't answer that right now. I'm going to go to Alina.
Yeah, so I think the basics have been covered, which is it's about character, but I think it's about character in the past too, because I think oftentimes when we think about swords being used, we're thinking about what Hope would call the earnest encounter, which is for the streets. And honestly, most of the time that swords were used historically, it wasn't always about the streets. It was about status. It was about showing yourself in a particular light. It was about, with dueling culture, a lot of times showing up was enough. It was the idea that you were there to defend your honor, and that gave you, social credibility. You see statements in period manuals where they say the first time you hit somebody, don't use the edge, use the flat, hit him with what we call a Prellhau admire, just to knock some sense into him so that you're not a murderer. And I think the way that you do a sword fight in a book similarly shows your character off in the same way that many of these people who did exhibition swordsmanship, which has existed for hundreds of years, all the way back to knightly tournaments, if we want to tie it into knights, we can. So that exhibition swordsmanship was about, this is the kind of person I am. This is the way that I fight. This is what I want to put on display. This is my skill. This is my honor. And I think you have the opportunity to do all of those same things in a sword fight in a book too. You can show off the person who starts off by hitting with the flat and then pays for their honor and not wanting to be a murderer by somebody else who is much less, concerned about such things. You really get a sense of who the characters are in a situation which is higher stakes in a sense than you might get from a conversation or a dispute or an argument in another form. And sword fights are also just great because It's up close and personal, and it requires in our minds a lot of skill, and it plays into a lot of ideas we have. Though so far in fiction, I've mostly written Qatar fights. So yeah.
And Lee, you can round us out on this.
Okay. So, I mean, as far as the writing side of things goes, I mean, you guys have got this covered quite nicely. So I'm only going to add a little bit to it. But what I do with it is I use the sword fights and fight scenes generally as a plot point, really. And I use it for characterization and sometimes a little bit of subtle world building in a way, which I'll get to in a second. But generally, it's the culmination of a plot point, and which uses jeopardy to get across the plot point. But for my stuff personally, I use it, I say, slightly subtle world building. I use it to put across the underlying theme of survival as the fittest. Because the world that obviously that I write in is quite grim, it's quite nasty. So I like to paint a picture of the world that they live in. And again, a big theme in that is the survival of the fittest. And I also use it to, obviously I write horror fantasy. Some of it's quite brutal, quite gory. So I use it just as an excellent device to put across some brutality and include a lot of the horror elements, not just from the scary stuff, but this is more the violent stuff. So it can be a really interesting plot device. But so that's how I use it. So.
Alina, you saying about hit them with the flat, not the edge. I cannot for the life of me remember what it is. I think it was in a book, but I read it years and years ago. I can't remember anything about the book. I just remember this one moment where there's been like two groups have had a parley, and the one has demanded surrender and they've said no, and they're going back to their lines to fight, and as they're watching the messenger leave, someone gets out a bow and arrow, and you can see the armies looking at them, and they're all like immediately raging because they're going to shoot the messenger in the back. And they use a fowling blunt, and they just send this fowling blunt down between his shoulder blades, knock him off his horse, but obviously they don't hurt him. And it always, that single scene, if anyone knows what it is, please put me out of my misery. It's just always stuck with me as like a different way to use a weapon. And a different, you've got it looks like you're going to do something, and it's like the ultimate bluff, isn't it? Because everyone thinks he topples off his horse. Everyone thinks, oh my God, they've shot him between the shoulder blades. No mercy, we're going to war, kind of thing. And then he gets up, and all he is humiliated. And I always found that like a really powerful little idea. And what you said just reminded me.
Yeah, and it can strike, you can do it in so many different ways. Something as simple as they're not hitting with the edge intentionally tells you a lot about a character. It can tell you that they're overconfident and dismissive of somebody. Yeah. It can tell you that they're really empathetic or that they're really merciful. And it depends on how you as the author choose to write it. So,
yeah.
Cool. I'm going to start with Lee, go the other way around. Lee, when you write a fight scene, do you know the details and outcome before you start writing, or do things organically grow as you go along?
Okay. Well, personally, yes, I usually know the outcome. If by the point that two characters have got to the point where they're having a fight, I usually kind of have a good idea where it's going to go and what's going to come out. I would like to experiment at some point with the completely organic fight scene and enroll with it. But at the minute, I do a bit of organic writing, but it's plotted, the major points, and then it sort of organically fills in the details. So, but yes, I don't know the particulars, so I don't know exactly who's going to do what and who's going to which sort of moves they're going to do, if you will. But yeah, I do know who's going to win and who's going to die or who's not going to die, depending on what I'm using it for. But yeah, I quite
sorry,
like
Lee. I think I asked the question badly. That it's the details I mean. Like, do you know when you start writing, and he's going to end up being run through the throat after disengage, or do you, or is the flow of the actual fight as you write it somewhat organic? I was talking about the details.
In that case, yes, I will generally write a fight scene. I mean, I might have a cool idea, like there's a part, it's not sword, but it's axe. There's a certain way of taking an axe out properly, which I just wanted to get this little detail in, and really, really little detail, and just little things like that. But generally, yeah, I will just see where it goes, and I'll have fun with it. But the outcome, obviously, yeah, I do know. But when I'm generally writing a fight scene, I just like to have fun and just sort of flow and see where it goes. So sometimes I even sort of I'll kind of know, or I can almost like imagine it, or even act it out a little bit. So I can like almost sort of pretend, oh, he could do that, he could do this, or that would be cool. And then, so yeah, that can be quite fun, and just sort of playing off ideas and things like that. But yes, as far as the details go, yes, I do that.
Alina?
I LARP all of my fight scenes, but that's just me. I basically am a seat of the pants writer all the time. And so while I know that, like, obviously my hero is not going to die in this, otherwise the book's over. That's all I know usually going into a fight scene, and I let the fight scene sort of tell itself. And I think that the way that I do it best is usually when I'm writing, I write fairly big chunks. And so I come from the not fight part to the fight part and then past the fight part so that they all have the same tone within that chunk, I suppose, unless I'm going for a tone change. Like one of the more recent ones I wrote was like two people fighting together against some assassins. But the whole point of it is that they're flirting with each other and dealing with the restrictions of 18th century society. Like, you're a lady, you shouldn't be doing this fencing business. Look, I'm doing better than you are kind of situation. And the assassins are like a backdrop to that, to tell that story. And so that comes from them kind of teasing each other ahead of that, teasing each other through the fight, and then at the end of it, having some resolution. And so I think, like, when I write fight scenes, there has to be that emotional thread that runs through it. And so that can either be serious or it can be playful, but the emotional thread needs to be there. So, yeah.
Cool. Sebastien?
I write fight scenes in largely in the same way that I write most things, which is I go in search of the story. I start writing in search of the story, which is not very helpful for writers watching us. So maybe something that's somewhat more helpful for me on that front is often what I'm actually searching for is the stakes. As Alina said, if your book has a main character reciting the story in first person and you're 40% through, it's very unlikely they're about to die. And so one of the things that you go in search of is the stakes. Sometimes those stakes are present before the fight begins. So, oh, there's this person who's about to be killed unless our hero, defeats the person who's about the executioner or something like that. But I actually find in some ways it's more fun. Fight scenes. So Shakespeare did this thing when he was in all his plays, right? When you get to the fight scene, there's nothing there. There's no stage direction. It just says they fight, which shows you how important he thought any of that really was, despite the fact that he had a famous fight choreographer at the time. The scenes were quite legendary and all that stuff. But it's really very easy for fights to kind of dissolve into, I kind of know what has to happen because because as a reader, I know I'm reading a book that's this long and I'm only this far through. And so I will go in search of stakes in a fight. What could happen in this fight, even if the character wins, that's awful, or things like that. Also, because that way, the most important thing I think you can do, other than give credibility to your characters inside of a fight, in other words, if you write a fight scene and the characters don't feel like they have any credibility, either because your sword fighting is ridiculous or just it doesn't feel real in some way. But the most important thing you can do other than that is surprise the reader. And so that's what I'm always looking for. And I think that's why I don't tend to plot out the fight ahead of time, because if I know I'm reaching for beats, it's harder for me, especially in the context of a fight scene, it's harder for me to immerse myself in those characters.
Anna?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much what everyone else says. I don't necessarily know how the fight, obviously I know who's going to win, who's going to lose, but I don't really know how the fight itself is going to play out. Slightly opposite to what Sebastien and Alina said, I have but caveated that I write in third person. I have actually got into the flow of a fight scene and killed off a major character who was not supposed to die at that point. Sort of in the zone, came out of the zone, realized what I'd done, burst into tears because they were one of my favorite characters. But then tweaked it and left it in, and that character's story literally just ended at that point in the book. which was not at all planned and did have some serious ramifications for how I finished the book, because all of a sudden, like, a fairly important character just wasn't there anymore. But I mean, aside from that, I don't really know. I think one of the favorite ones that I have written is in my second book, Dark Soul, when one of the big bads gets killed in this really ignominious way, which just brought me such joy, because he just had this sociopathic, overinflated sense of himself, his ego. And he just gets beaten to death with a helmet. Like they just cave his head in. They just keep hitting him until he's just like that fat. And I had no idea that I was going to write that. I knew that it was time for him to die. And I knew that I didn't want to give him the kind of death that he would crave, that if he had to die, he was going to do it in this remarkable way and be remembered forever, and he is going to be remembered forever. He's going to be remembered forever as the guy who had his head beaten in by a helmet. So yeah, I mean, like you were saying about bringing like the stakes, or maybe bringing like some humor in and things like that. Those are really the only things I concentrate on. How it actually plays out. As long as it all makes sense, I also walk through my fight scenes. So I'll be the attacker, and then I'll be the defender, and make sure that does my right arm go there or does it go there? And once we've got through those, and I know that the mechanics work, then yeah, I'll just work on actually making the scene flow.
Can I just
Anna, I have
agree
also killed off a major character in the flow, a major character who I loved. Totally
It's
works
horrible.
sometimes. No, it can be great. Sorry, Sebastien, go ahead.
That was Lee.
Well, I think that might have been
sorry.
me there, Kristen. No, I was just going to agree with Anna and yourself there. Actually, I actually love you're writing something. It's not quite as organic as Anna's, but I mean, I also write third person and with multiple points of view. So there's sometimes a real big character that you love, and I just think I'm going to kill them, and no one's going to expect it, and it's going to be great. And I slightly sadistic pleasure from just going ha, and then a secondary character will then pick up the pace. But yeah, I love doing that, and it keeps the readers on their toes, because they don't know who's going to die, and they don't know who's safe. No one's safe. The plot armor thing gets removed, and I think I'm a big fan of that. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, I like surprise. I did that with a fight scene at the end of Gifting Fire, where I wasn't expecting to do it, and then I did it, and I was like, my editor's going to freak out, everybody's going to freak out, but I'm doing it anyway. So that's always fine. I think that's a good choice.
Yeah.
So I think this is obvious, but I'm hoping we can all just get a tale out of each other. Do you use elements of your fighting or martial arts experience directly in writing? Maybe with an example. And I'm going to start this time with Alina.
As little as possible, honestly, because I've trained in martial arts my whole life. I've trained in fencing my whole life. I was trained by a U.S. Air Force lieutenant colonel in fighter piloting. So when I did my dragon fights, yeah, all of those techniques that are used in the dragon fights are real fighter piloting techniques and maneuvers. And if you know the maneuvers, you can think, oh yeah, I know how this works. But there's nothing more boring to read than someone executed a good lag roll reversal and went in for a good clean talons kill. That's not good writing. Similarly, I don't really want to write every disengage of a fencing scene unless I have to. The idea that somebody's going to go into Von Tag and then they're going to, Zornhau at their opponent after, the opponent has made an Oberhau. It's the worst kind of writing. And it's something that I think martial artists fall into, maybe more so than people like Sebastien who come from a stage background, because for us it's about like we know these techniques and we know how to use them to kill the opponent, and so we get lost in the little nitty-gritty details of what you do in a fight, because in a fight I am thinking about like, oh, maybe I'll try a beat here to see if that works to get in at this opponent's guard. But as a reader, what I want is emotion and character development and a sense of excitement, and none of that really comes from a rote recitation of technique. So I find that I oftentimes, less so now, but when at least earlier, I would write two different versions of fight scenes. I would write a fight scene through, and then I would go back through it and heavily edit to remove 90% of meaningless technique stuff that I like, but that doesn't belong in a book. So yeah, as little as possible, I would say.
Sebastien.
I agree. I don't actually bring too many of my personal experiences into it, and I think because the thing that's most easily forgotten, especially when you start getting into technique, is that you could fight 1,000 modern sword fights. You could be the world's greatest epee champion, which is, I think we can all agree, is the one true sword of the modern era, or whatever that other stuff.
Wow.
You could be the greatest there is, and you will have never fought anything remotely comparable to a duel, or any, whereas there are people who have never picked up a sword who have who have been in a situation where they've had to fight for their own lives, right? There's people who are, victims of domestic abuse who know more about what it's like to fight for your life than I would. And so that's the part, and almost invariably when a reader is reading the scene, that's what they're looking for. That's what they're missing. That sense of, we tend sometimes talk about realism in terms of, the precision of the technique. And I agree with Alina. I hate it when there's a Zornhau over and Oberhau under an Übermensch. Like, those things drive me crazy. But the thing you're looking for is that human experience that lies underneath it. And so more often I've written fight scenes that were informed by being a rock musician in a band, like on stage in a crappy dive bar, and watching a fight where crazy guy always wins. Like, that's my one rule of combat. The craziest person always wins, because they don't care about getting hit in the face. And so so that's the challenge. Like, for new writers, especially when they're sitting down to write a sword fight, like, it's really natural to focus a lot on technique. And I don't think that's a bad thing to do. I think it is fine to sort of bring some of that into it. But the thing you're really aiming for is what's the feeling of this situation?
Anna.
Yeah, I mean, I pretty much agree. I mean, obviously, the majority of my experience is in Japanese martial arts. So, there's no way that I'm going to be talking about gyakuzukis and maigaris in a Eurocentric, medieval-esque fantasy novel. What I do like to do is I try and give a flavor of the character's expertise. So I might talk about how they calculate distance. So I might say he steps into range, or she stepped back out of range, or something like that. Just to sort of give these little flavors that they know what they're talking about, or maybe they snap their hip when they punch, or something like that. But like as everyone else has said, I try and keep those things to an absolute minimum. And I think once I know that the scene works as a scene, as I said, once I've walked it through and I've fought both sides of it, so to speak, as long as I know that it works, then I will strip back as much as I can, and yeah, I will add in screaming and fear and people shitting themselves, because those are the things that are universally relatable to. No one's going to understand if I talk about distance. Well, certain people will, but the majority of people won't. But everyone is going to understand when you talk about the massive adrenaline rush that you get when you realize you're about to get into a fight. Those things are universally applicable. So those tend to be the things, and they are also the things that heighten characterization. So those tend to be the things that I focus on. I would love to be able to write a really in-depth nitty-gritty, but like Alina said, nobody's going to read that. No one's going to want to read it. So I don't.
I find I don't want to read it either, though. Like, I have to say, Anna, like, I don't like to read it when I go back to some of my old books that never got published where I did that. I skipped those scenes, and that tells me a lot,
Yeah, definitely.
Lee?
So again, I agree completely with Alina. I generally will not put in a move by move fight scene. It's just, again, it's totally boring, and you guys totally covered that. But what I do, there's two little minor things I do. I do use my experience in combat to help me visualize things. So saying, like Alina said, she'll be doing LARPing and things, and I will stand there in my front room and I with my sword, I'll be like, he's on my axe or whatever I'm using, and he's going to go there, and he's going to go there. You don't have to write it down like that, but it lets you visualize it, as a writer, how that's going to play out. Even if it doesn't end up on the page, you at least can see the more important parts. Yeah, again, as Anna says, the characterization, you get the fear and things like that, and that all comes in later. But the other thing I use is I use it to describe, let's say, little tiny detail. The odd tiny detail will sneak in, but it's nothing important. It's, I'd say, how he takes the axe out in a certain way. Just that one sentence I mentioned earlier. It's just little things like that. It has no bearing. It's just that little tiny thing that makes someone who might recognize it go, oh, that's cool, but without detracting from the story at all. And the other thing is, like, I'd like them to be accurate, but at the same time, I mean, if we're writing fantasy, a lot of these things, there's going to be fantastic elements in there. There's going to be, you might be riding a dragon. I mean, or in my case, fighting zombies or some horrible monsters or something like that. And, you can't really relate that from experience. So you've got to be able to incorporate the fantastic into with the realism, but the realism, I think, should take a back seat, whereas the story should and the sort of the characterization should be the forefront. It should be what's in their head rather than what's going on in their hands. If you see my point, so.
And I think too, I want to add a caveat to what I said, which is, like, I do think that you should throw in a little bit of spice. So, like, if I say someone took up the garden cart with a flourish, the reader doesn't have to know what that means. They just know, oh, this is like, they know what they're doing. And it's enough that the reader knows that they know what they're doing. Or I wrote a fight scene which was actually between two secondary characters where the main character is not allowed to fight in it, and she's in a carriage and she's shouting advice to her uncle who's doing the fight. And she uses technical terminology when she's shouting advice, and he's like, just be quiet, I'm fighting over here, and it's one of those things where you get to throw in that spice and flavor without boring anybody. So
yeah, one thing, there's a similar caveat that I'd like to give, which is that there is an opportunity early on in a fight scene to teach the reader how the mechanics of the fight is going to work, like to teach them the rules, in the same way that when someone's reading a Harry Potter book, they kind of want to know, like, okay, well, what is he doing with the wand? Like, I want to know how to cast the spell too. And so often, I mean, I tend to write a lot of duel scenes. A lot of duel scenes, tend to begin with a certain amount of testing and things like that. And there's always, the nice classic trick where the character whose point of view you're writing from is expressing an opinion about the way the other fighter is moving or operating, and sort of going, oh God, it's, she's one of those people who disengages at everything. Like, she pretends to thrust at your chest, and then all of a sudden the sword's on the other side. And I hate people like that, and it kind of allows the reader to get just enough material early on in that fight scene so that you can do the thing that's, I think, almost most necessary of all in a fight, which is you need the reader to choreograph 90% of it. And I think that's sort of what we're all saying. We don't want to put in all those details because we want the reader to be choreographing it while we're delivering the drama through dialogue, through thoughts, impressions, and things like that.
I'm just going to throw in here that one of the most interesting pieces of fan mail I ever received was from an SAS officer who said, I love it when you write complicated fight scenes, but you got to know that when you're killing people afterwards, you can't remember any part of what you did. And as that is literally my experience of fighting publicly in armor, that afterwards I have no memory of exactly what happened. I've always thought that was kind of cool. Anyway, do you think that martial arts, and I guess this is directly related to my SAS guy, do you think martial arts adequately reflect the reality of combat? And does that matter at all? And I want to be specific about this because I think I didn't ask the last question well. So one of the funniest pieces of fan mail I ever received was somebody saying, I hate your books. I play World of Warcraft and I know how combat works. So that being said, as things like
that was me, by the way, but
as HEMA, but a whole lot of other things like reenactment and LARPing and a lot of other experiences affect everybody's readers. Their perception of what combat is Hollywood, Marvel Comics, may differ radically from what actual combat is, and yet be vital to the way we write. So, like, what do you think about, and maybe you've just covered this off, maybe it's the same question a different way, but like, does martial arts relate to real combat, and does that even matter? Or are you world building as much when you create combat in your world as you are when you create religion or mountains? This time, I think it is Lee's turn to be. Am I right? Is it Lee's turn to begin? Sorry, I'm a terrible moderator. Go ahead, Lee.
So, I mean, from my experience, unfortunately, not at all. So, martial arts is very much it's where, you know, it's fake basically. There is no jeopardy, there is no life on the line. So I mean, unless, like your SAS guy, unless you're fighting to the death, you cannot really replicate that on you know, in the martial arts setting at all. No matter how much intent you put into your cuts and how much intent you put in, at the end of the day, you know, I mean, often we're wearing protective gear or armor if you're in a reenactment. You know you're safe. You might get a broken hand or something, but you know you're not going to die. And I think without that real jeopardy, you can't simulate it at all. So sadly, no, it doesn't reflect the reality of combat at all. The only real way to understand that is to literally go to war. So in respect for those guys that do, but yeah, I mean, again, just to add, Miles, to your story about the guy. We've had a guy come into our club before, and he was like, he said he's really experienced. He knows exactly what he's doing. And we were like, so what have you done before? And he's like, I've played about 600 hours of whatever Skyrim. And I was just like, good lord. but yeah. So as far as the combat goes, we can't simulate. It's the only thing we can't actually simulate. We can get the technique, we can get the intent, we can get the speed, but we cannot get the actual jeopardy of the life and death sort of feel that's going to drive someone in that moment to either fight or flight. So unfortunately, it negates a lot of the martial arts experience in that sense completely. It's a simulation. Yeah.
Anna?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think it can give you a lot. You know, I can write categorically how it feels to be punched in the face. You know, I know exactly what that feels like. I know what it feels like to have my feet kicked from under me. You know, things like that. It can give you a shadow. It can give you a sense of what's real. It isn't real, and it can't ever be real. But then again, it's a book, so it isn't real anyway. You know, but it can, I think, yeah, so it can't replicate the real thing in any way. But then again, the reason why we train for as many hours a week or a month as we do, is so that our bodies know how to react when we are taken by surprise. And I think that is probably the closest we will ever come to someone who has been to war, is that they have been honed to react in certain ways to certain triggers. And martial artists haven't had it to the same intensity, but their bodies will do the same thing under the same kind of stressors or triggers. Obviously not with the same outcome, hopefully. I'm not advocating that martial arts go out there and start killing people. But I do remember, I think one of probably the most adrenaline fueled 90 seconds of my life was during my second dan black belt karate qualification, when I had to stand in the center of a ring of 6 other black belts who could attack me any way they chose without warning, from in front of me to the sides or behind. And it only lasted 90 seconds, and you were not expected to be able to defend against all of them, because some of them were attacking from behind. Sometimes you had 2 attacking at once. And it was genuinely terrifying, even though I knew it wasn't going, that they all had excellent control and nobody was going to hurt me. The most I would get hurt was if I stepped into an attack instead of out of it and like doubled the force. But other than that, it was genuinely terrifying. And I knew them all. I was friends with them all, and I trusted them all with my life. But when it came to it, because I didn't know where those attacks were coming from, it was genuinely frightening. And that is probably the closest that and please let that be the closest I ever come to knowing what it feels like to be in a genuine fight. I think I might have gone off topic a little bit, but hopefully that helped.
Sebastien.
So, I think I'm the least martial arty of everyone here. But I will certainly say that I think reflexes are of course vital in a body for fighting, and martial arts builds those reflexes. It builds the strength, and in some cases, even as an épée fencer, you get hit in the chest hard enough times, and you're no longer afraid of that, and so all those things make a difference. But I was thinking about this story I saw about World War II, the British hate schools. Does anyone know about the British hate schools? They had to take British soldiers and they would put them in these schools to make them hate the Germans. Because even though these were soldiers who were going to war, who were being taught to shot, they were not being taught this is an exhibition fight. They knew that the enemy is there. They've heard all the stories, and they still had to overcome the fact that these British soldiers would be going across there, and they would see another soldier who kind of looked enough like them and could theoretically be related, and go, I need you to hate this person so much that you'll kill them on sight. And that psychology is the thing that's often skipped by. It's one of the things I find kind of offensive is probably the wrong word, but when people talk about realism, when they're talking about fantasy novels or adventure novels, I often think like the things they talk about are so preposterous, like whether someone would or wouldn't use this move instead of this move, instead of the real problem, which is actually killing people is really, really, really hard unless you're a sociopath or a psychopath rather. And so again, for writers, there's an opportunity there because you can have a character who we know is strong and powerful and stuff, and you can make them fight that side of the battle with themselves, just remembering like how much armies, how much when they train soldiers, they have to teach them how to hurt another human being because, and this is one of the few nice things about us, I think, it's actually not that easy for most of us to want to hurt another person.
Alina.
I'm actually going to disagree with everybody. And I think in some senses, martial arts are more realistic than fighting on the battlefield. And I'm going to say that and be really bold about it. And the reason I'm going to say that is because if you look at the history of human interpersonal violence encounters, far and away, warfare is like the lowest number of them that you're going to encounter. Now, if we're writing about warfare in a fantasy novel, that's one thing. But if we're writing about violent encounters in general, violent encounters are bound by social rules to the same degree that everything else in society is bound by social rules, and in many ways similar to the way that martial arts is bound by social rules. That's not to say that in a fight, even in a bar fight, people are trying not to hurt each other, but to a degree, they may well be. They may be in a situation where they want to hit this person, but they don't want to go to jail, or they don't want this person to be so badly injured that they're charged with attempted murder. It's one thing to get in a drunken punch fight with this guy. It's another thing when somebody pulls a knife. And oftentimes you see that in violent confrontations where people will get to a certain level of violence, and then other people will be like, whoa, guys, that's too much level of violence. You shouldn't be doing that anymore. That's too far. And so I think that this notion that every time we talk about fights, it has to be, the gritty SAS officer, this is what real killing is like. I think that is a myth, because I think, Sebastian's points, to some degree, people have a hard time killing each other. But to some degree, too, like you look at the history of actual violent encounters that people have, knights oftentimes wanted to capture you alive for ransom money and didn't want to kill you. A lot of the time you might be, a friend of mine's been doing a lot of research on Guts of the Iron Hand, and he is constantly taking people for ransom and trading sides and working with different groups and doing different vendettas, but it's all bound by rules and regulations that are social, if not codified, even in a place like 15th or 16th century Germany. And so I think the idea that everything is always to the death all the time on the battlefield, and it has to be this super gritty macho thing is is not realistic. And that sometimes what's more realistic is a duel that I read about the Chevalier de Saint-Georges having, where he and his friend got mad at each other in the fencing salle and decided to settle it with real swords. And they went out and stood there with real swords, kind of poking at each other, but not really, because neither of them wanted to kill the other one, because that's really extreme, until one of their friends broke it up and said, let's go get drinks. And they were like, yeah, that sounds good. And then they went for coffee or whatever. And that was the end of it. And that was a real duel, violent encounter for the streets, but it was, that's what actually happened, rather than this crazy, I have to work myself up to the point of murdering somebody business.
For the sake of argument, though, Alina, just because I love talking about dueling, when the 11th Earl of Loudon and his wife's lover fought a duel in Hyde Park, each of them stabbed the other 11 times. I mean, and they both died horribly of peritonitis. There was some real rage going on there, and maybe not very much good fencing.
Yeah, I mean, this is true. You can get the exact opposite encounter in a duel, and that's interesting. But does that mean that when we're looking at violent encounters in terms of duels, we should always be looking at the two guys who stab each other 11 times in a frenzy? I think that part of good writing is the realization that characters have to show themselves, and there will be the character who's so angry he's going to stab that person 11 times. It doesn't matter what happens to him. That's an interesting character. Just as interesting as the character who feels insulted in the salle d'armes, goes a little farther than he should have, and then realizes he's in way over his head and needs to cut it out. I think those are both really valid places to start from writing. So,
absolutely, and it gives you a great spectrum. And I'll debate with Sebastien the human tendency to kill or not kill another day.
But I just want to say on that, though, that raises, again, another really good opportunity for writers, which has to do with the imbalance of intention in a fight. So Alina referred to, a guy pulls out a knife in a bar fight. Actually, probably 90% of the time, they're trying to that's an effort to put an end to the fight. It's like, I know I'm not going to be able to win this, so I'm going to show you this. And this is like, so I don't think you want to go past this point, which is, again, why I think crazy guy always wins. But I also agree on the social rules. And I think all of these are things that can add texture to a writer's fight scenes. A good friend of mine told me once about the first time he ever got into a fight. Beforehand, he was talking to his dad. His dad was an ex-cop or something. And he was like, oh, I don't know if I got in a fight, what would I do? And, I would have to hold back. And his father said, no. If you get into a fight with someone, you just try to hit them and hurt them as bad as you possibly can. Don't worry. Someone will pull you off of them before it's too late. If you go to a party and you get into a fight, son, you just do, because if you try to think of anything else, you're going to be the guy on the bottom. So don't worry. Someone will pull you off of them. And it was such an interesting, to me, notion of here's somebody saying, look, there is a set of social rules. To enter into violence, you must exceed the social rules yourself and count on society to pull you back. And again, as an opportunity for writers, when you're, think of all the times we've probably been in this situation. I certainly was. I was a pretty wimpy kid. That you're like, somebody starts pushing you around, and you're kind of looking around like, social rules. Hello, anybody going to break this up before and that's one of the most. Again, when I said earlier about like the problem of trying to capture the feeling, that's a place we can all go to capture that feeling, because I suspect that's part of it. The, oh my God, I can't believe this is actually going to happen, is something we've all felt, even if we haven't necessarily been in a life or death duel.
I just want to say, because not everybody had this experience, my uncle was a sociopath and a war hero, and his attitude towards killing, which has shaped a couple of characters I've written, was more horrible than most horror novels. And it wasn't even cold, it was chatty. Like when I was about 9, he said, if you ever shoot somebody in your house, make sure you go over and shoot them in the head, because then the cops never hear anything but your side of the story. And I was like 9, and I thought, I need my dad now. I need somebody to moderate my uncle's behavior. But at the same time, as somebody who had been in hand-to-hand combat in the Second World War in the Pacific, he did provide some different points of view. Anyway, yes, I loved this, because all I wanted to get to here is you can get character out of it. There's a lot to reflect. There's a lot of different types of people. And my own experience, and I was in the military, was that different people have very different reactions to the whole thing you guys were talking about. Very different reactions. Anyway,
I'm
I
sure,
think
I'm
we've
sure there's at least one person watching this who I have bumped up against this so many times that the whole women can't write warfare thing. So it just like you're saying about, do martial arts adequately reflect the reality of combat? The number of times that comments have been made on my books that, oh, I won't read military fantasy by a woman because they don't understand warfare.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
That's ridiculous, though, because
this person who's sitting there, this fantasy reader who's sitting there, have they been in the military? Have they seen combat? What is this sort of stereotypical ballpark idea that I am any less qualified than anybody else?
Also, does modern warfare have anything to do with fantasy warfare? Because I mean, the idea that warfare is the same all the time, and that going to war in the Pacific in World War II is identical to being on a medieval battlefield is absurd. We all know that's not true. It's governed by different rules and different social taboos. It's governed by different weapon systems and different cultures. Like, warfare is very, very different depending on where you are on the battlefield. I mean, I've been doing a lot of research on 18th century India, and there were some European authors who wrote, it seemed like they just got a bunch of troops together and lined up to see which one got scared by the trumpets first. And they were being derisive, and of course it's very colonial, and you have to take that with a grain of salt. But to some degree, there's kinds of warfare that people have throughout history been like, well, this isn't serious warfare, or this isn't real warfare, or this is religious warfare, or this is this kind of warfare. And it's like, well, at some point, either warfare is warfare, or warfare is a multifaceted thing that encompasses many different cultures and many different behaviors. And the idea that we have to see it through the lens of somebody who was in Afghanistan recently is absurd.
Yeah. Sorry, I want to agree with Alina completely and say it is absurd. I hate those attitudes. And in last year, and I think on this same panel and in a whole bunch of other places, my shout line is war is a cultural artifact, like, and often reflects the societies who want to conduct it. And I have a lot of very anti-right-wing things to say on the subject, but instead of me talking, I'm going to say, I think we've covered this off, so maybe we can just whip through it briefly so we can give more time to the next question. But do you deliberately use the terms of art from swordspersonship or any other martial arts when you write? And I think we've already touched on it, but let's just look at that again, maybe in light of knowing that there is a growing readership that has some familiarity with this. I'm going to start with Sebastien, because Sebastien, I believe you have the experience of basically being a fight director, right? You've actually written fights out. So send us somewhere.
I follow the Phoebe from Friends guitar school of writing fight terminology, which is, so for those who didn't have the benefit of watching Friends through the 90s and the regrettable impacts that may have had on your consciousness, Phoebe always was like, the guitar player was terrible, and when she was trying to teach Joey, she refused to teach him like a G chord or an A chord. She called him like Dragon Claw and something else, and she had all these weird names for things. So when I write about the language, I almost always try to invent as much of it as I can, because I specifically don't want people getting into that mindset, because the only people who recognize those terms are generally going to I just find it, for me, it sort of pulls me out. Now, that's not always the case, and other people can do it well, but I just think it's more fun if I'm inventing my own language half the time anyway, to invent different names for things.
Alina.
Yeah, I basically will use the terms of art for the type of weapon that's being used as the character would understand it. But like, I do it like a seasoning, and it's like, you don't want it to be overly seasoned. And so it's a very strong seasoning. And so you have to be very judicious with where you sprinkle it in. And so I tend to reserve it for things where it's an offhand way of showing the character's expertise or lack of expertise. And so if I'm writing a character who's very good at fencing, which one of my recent characters is, I will throw in a term of art as a way of saying, oh, this person knows what they're doing with a sword. Or like I mentioned, a scene where the character's shouting advice using sword terminology or talking about, that's literally, I just pulled it out of Angelo for like how to fight Germans. And I'm like, they're going to do this. They use strong beats and they hold their left hand over their chest. You can tell they're a German. And like the other person is just like, I'm trying to fight someone to death here, you know? And so it's one of those situations where like, if it adds to the characterization, it's great. And if it makes you have to cross your eyes and think about, well, where is the sword in space, then I've done a really bad job. So.
And Lee.
So yeah, I mean, we've covered a lot of it before. I mean, generally, I will never ever use a term from a fencing manual. I mean, I don't write in a period where there might be duelists. I mean, if you're writing small sword and rapier type weapons, then there is a scope for it. But again, like Sebastien says, I would invent a term. So I'd invent something. I'd very quickly let the reader be able to understand that is some kind of sword move. I won't describe it. It'll just be something that they do. But if it's outside of a common usage, if it's outside of a reader that has no idea about what I'm talking about, then now I've lost that reader. So I don't want to be putting in anything that's outside of the common usage at all. They need. I will I'll make up things to help you sort of envisage a fight, but I wouldn't personally use like a specific term. Like I wouldn't be saying, overhowl or anything like that. I'd be saying, cuts over the top. Or I mean, things like riposte I might use because that's in the common usage. That everyone understands that, usually. But specific
Except
words,
fencing
specific manuals, I probably wouldn't use as much. No, personally.
And Anna.
Yeah, I totally agree with what everyone else has said. I use stuff that's passed into common usage. So if it's unarmed combat, I might I use uppercut. I might use foot sweep. Is probably the most out there that I would probably go. I mean, things like front kick. Everyone can pretty much figure out what those things are. Where it comes to, if it comes to like sword fights, then I'm probably just going to stick with things like thrust and parry. Maybe diagonal cut would be probably the most descriptive that I would get, because I think you use too much of it and you start losing what the characters are doing. You're so focused on what their weapons are doing that you're not thinking about what they are doing and thinking and feeling as people. And as we've established, that's the most important part of writing any kind of a combat scene.
You're
all in agreement. Go ahead, Lee.
Sorry. I say it's quite funny. I mean, one of the reasons I got into HEMA and into sword fighting and things is because I wanted to, be able to add things to future writing projects. And the further you get into it, the more you realize, the more you know, the less you actually want to be putting into the book anyway. So it becomes a bit of a catch-22. But I thought that was quite amusing. I realized that some time back. I was like, oh.
Yeah, my
first not useless, isn't it?
My first book was published before I started HEMA. And everyone was going, oh my God, your second book, your third book, they're going to be absolutely packed full. And I think if you read the trilogy through, you probably can't tell at which point I started HEMA. I hope not anyway. But I don't think you can, because it quickly became apparent. I mean, I love doing research and I love putting stuff in, and my editor just takes it straight back out again. I mean, I learned how to make pine bark bowls and how they would be sealed with pine resin, and they'd be completely waterproof, and I wrote an entire scene about how they got the bark off and they bent it, blah, blah, sealed it, and my editor just redlined the whole lot. I was like, no, we don't need any of that. So I've learned my lesson.
See, Anna, I know I'm not supposed to talk, but your editor might just be wrong.
I mean, it was a very cool fact.
I view writing as basically taking another person to an immersion reenactment. And I believe that it's part of my job to immerse them in the world that I've created, or maybe the real world has created. So I would actually, I won't name names, but an editor not very long ago said, like, the whole shopping in Venice thing, cut that. Nobody wants to read about shopping in Venice in the Middle Ages. And I was like, you're wrong. Almost every medieval reenactor who buys my books wants to read. As a matter of fact, there are people who will only read this book for the shopping scene in Venice. And I believe I was correct. Anyway, so I'm going to go to a sort of darker topic, which really, really interests me. And I don't know if it's going to really, really interest you. But it's very much out there in the world that SFF, the whole world of speculative fiction, has run off to become violence porn. And one of the things that does very strongly interest me as both a writer and a person who's experienced violence, and maybe a person who's older and has like slightly different thoughts, is that there's a lot of violence in a lot of modern speculative fiction. And sometimes I wonder why it is that we don't have sort of novels that are more like Jane Austen or F. Scott Fitzgerald, but set in speculative fiction settings, novels of manners, novels of culture and society, and violence does seem often to be a staple. And so is it a staple? Why or why not? And I am going to, I can't remember where we are, so I'm going to start with Alina.
Okay. Do I think that, so the question is, do I feel like sci-fi fantasy has too much violence in it?
Is it fair to call what we do violence porn, and why or why not?
No, I don't think it's fair to call what we do violence porn. I think sometimes you can have a catharsis through violence and fantasy. That I think what we have to get away from is the idea that violence and fantasy is real violence, because it's absurd. It's not. Like, you know, sometimes when I'm bored, I'll play a video game or something, right? And recently I was playing Empire Total War because I'm a huge history dork, and it's 18th century warfare, and I get to pretend to be like Napoleon, basically, except pre-Napoleon. And I conquer some places, and I have soldiers who kill a bunch of people. Do I have any desire to randomly conquer foreign countries and have a bunch of people shot with muskets? Nope, not really. Not at all. So does that reflect on you know, my inner thoughts or feelings or experiences? No. I mean, like, there's a scene in one of my books where a certain character gets blown up with a cannon, and it's very cathartic. You're like, yes, what a perfect way. Like, literally that person gets obliterated with a swivel gun, and you're like, well, now am I going to go shoot somebody with a swivel gun? Are my readers going to do that? No. But most of the readers came back with like, that was so cathartic, because part of the reason we read heroes or villains or whatever is because we like to have larger than life characters. Any character who just goes through life the way we go through life is going to be pretty boring. You know, they wake up, they go eat the same thing for breakfast every day. They go do, you know, they sit in their apartment all day because of COVID, and then that's the end of their day. And then we just write that for 300 pages. I think that's absurd. So I think that, do we need to be careful about what we're saying with violence? I think the answer to that is yes. I think that we have to be using that violence that's within these books to tell a story that is meaningful and liberating for people and edifying in some way, in addition to being entertaining. But I don't think that violence in fiction is violence. I think violence in fiction is storytelling and catharsis, and it's a totally different animal. So that would be my take.
Sebastien.
Oh man. I think that it's a question for which I'm entirely unsuited to answer in some ways. So I think generally, Alina's right that, you know, fantasy violence is not fantasy. It's not violence. It's not real violence. I think we have to ask ourselves, though, what are the things that do seem to produce harm that people describe, like readers will describe as harming them. I always, and I'm going to turn to a slightly less controversial example than some of the obvious that might come up, which is you can kill 5,000 people in your book. You can make it as brutal and horrible as you want. But if you have someone kill a dog, the reader's going to express that they've been harmed. And I'm going to choose, for the purpose of this conversation, to treat that as genuine. That when someone says I was harmed by this, I couldn't sleep, you made me feel horrible, that they're speaking honestly and genuinely. And what that tells me is I don't always know what, you know, that when we try to rationalize what's violent and horrible and affecting in fantasy and what isn't, that we're not working from all of the information that we would probably need to make a lot of those kinds of judgments. I think one of the from the standpoint of speaking to writers who are trying to write stories with violence in them, my first advice is, never torture the horse. Having done that, and Falcon killed 4,000 people, but somebody tortures a horse in the book, and it's like, that's it, I'm out. But the second is, ask yourself what what troubles me more in terms of what you were raised at the beginning, Miles, about this notion of fantasy has become kind of violence porn, is what is the moral universe that you are presenting? If your moral universe is it's okay for people to die all the time or be killed, then that's fine. But don't ask the reader to say to go, oh, but now my hero's trusted friend died, so we should all be really sad. That was a horrible injustice that he died, when your heroes just killed a whole bunch of people that were other people's friends, which is something I see happen a lot in grimdark sometimes, which is, it's not, I'm not a grimdark writer. But I would look at that. What is your moral universe? What are you actually saying about violence when you're using it? And so as long as the writer is conscious of that, I almost don't mind what they do. I just want to know they thought about it. Because otherwise we do this thing, which we're now seeing in society a lot more, which is the notion that, oh, yeah, some horrible violence is completely justified because of who it's being done to and who's committing it. And I think that's what bothers me more when I see that reflected in fantasy, right? Because I don't think fantasy really drives a lot. I think it reflects the societies that we're in. And when I see fantasy that's sort of saying, yeah, it's okay to like torture someone as long as you're torturing the bad guy.
Lee.
Okay, so I've actually thought about this an awful lot. One of the reasons being, I am incredibly guilty of this. Okay, so I write fantasy horror, heavy on horror. There is some absolutely awful things that happen in some of my books. I don't pull back at all. So I'd like you just for a minute to separate Lee, who writes the Dead Sagas, and Lee, who is thinking philosophically about normal life. Okay, because I do have different points of view on this. So Lee, the horror writer, will pull absolutely no punches. Sebastien mentioned the dog. You don't kill the dog. Well, there's a dog in some of my books, and well, let's keep an eye on that dog, let's just say, because, no one's safe. I mean, kids aren't safe, dogs aren't safe, people aren't safe, women, children, anyone, no one's safe. And they will all probably die absolutely horribly. And but the point being is, what I'm trying to do in that point is to make people uncomfortable on purpose. So I literally think, what's the most uncomfortable thing I can do to make, I'm trying to do that on purpose. But so in that respect, I mean, I'm totally guilty of you could say violence porn. But the other side of it, so I've thought about this quite a lot, and fighting and violence is only one element. When you look at fantasy, it's only just one element. I actually wrote a note on this just so I wouldn't get it wrong. So that's just one element. A lot of fantasy. So a lot of fantasy has no fighting in whatsoever. So I don't think it's fair to say that science fiction or fantasy is glorifying violence porn. Some of it is. Some of the stuff, say the genre I write in, or some of the, the grimdark, which I touch on as well. Sometimes that totally can be true, or horror. But a lot of fantasy is very fluffy and nice and has absolutely no violence in whatsoever. And it's just written here. So not even an important one. Yeah. So fighting's just an act of violence. It's just one element. It's just an important one. But combat is bred into our nature. So I mean, readers do enjoy a good fight. I mean, a lot of the horror fans and the horror people I speak to at horror conventions, they're part of them is a little bit sick. They love it. They absolutely love absolutely gory, horrible films. And maybe it is, as Alina suggests, something that stops them from doing. They can play out those strange fantasies on the page or on the screen without having to do it in real life and things like that. Obviously, they probably wouldn't, but at least they get that notion out of their head. But. So yeah, in certain respects, I am definitely trying to make people uncomfortable on purpose because like the horrible, gory things. But at the same time, I don't think that should reflect on sci-fi fantasy at all, because a lot of it is completely nothing to do with violence. I've read loads of fantasy with hardly any fighting in at all. The most violent thing is a terrible frown, and that's about it. So yeah, I don't think it's fair to say that, but I can see what they're saying about what I write and what grimdark in general. I mean, it can be very gory, but I think that's what people want. They want this detachment that they can play out these ideas and then experience, just like watching a horror film, experience that without having to see it in real life, because no one wants to see that in real life at all, because it's horrible. So, but again, to figure out what you're doing and to make that, you have to think, what is the worst? I mean, there's been times where I've thought, what would be the worst thing that could ever happen to my kids? And then I've written that, about a kid in a book and things like that. Absolutely, terrible thing. What am I most afraid of? And things like that. And that can be real good fuel for a horror writer. But again, it's the sort of stuff that you just never want to experience in real life. So, but yeah, I've thought about that quite a lot. So I don't want to ramble, because I know I'm starting to repeat myself. So, but yeah, it's a really interesting question. That is definitely. So many different avenues.
No, I don't agree that it is entirely violence porn. I think that if we broaden out the SFF genre away from just books, I think there's a possibility that people's viewpoints are being skewed by films, and particularly by video games. I mean, the sheer amount of violence that you can get in video games these days. I'm not a gamer, so this is all very much just secondhand what I've picked up. But I mean, even films and stuff now, the level of violence. I mean, what constituted an 18 certificate film when I was a kid is now a 15, and it's just okay. So the sex is minor and the swearing is minor, but the violence is through the roof. And that's not just fantasy films. That's any film these days. And I think our threshold for violence has increased. And the people who are saying that, I wonder whether it's had to do with things like the TV adaptations of maybe The Witcher and Game of Thrones and stuff like that. I mean, they certainly didn't hold back. I mean, if you think about even the Lord of the Rings trilogy, the films, if you read, when you read The Two Towers and the Battle of Helm's Deep, they're not talking about viscera and guts and blood flying into the night, but that is exactly what you get in the films, because you have to, because it's a different medium, it's a visual medium. And so I think that things like that, which have become such huge cult hits, have probably skewed the opinions of people who wouldn't consider themselves fantasy fans, but they watch Game of Thrones and they watch Lord of the Rings and they probably watch The Witcher. They might be watching The Wheel of Time, who knows? But they wouldn't. But if you ask them, they'll be like, "Oh no, I don't read fantasy." But so their opinion has been coloured by the TV and the film rather than actually the books. And I would also offer up historical fiction, military fiction. So, books that are set during the Vietnam War, books that are set during World War II. Homer, have you read the Odyssey and the Iliad? I mean, good God, there's just, people are dying all over the place. So to say that it's just us, I think is absolutely untrue. I think, we possibly, as we've all discussed, we use warfare as a reason to examine characters, So the way I always see my characters is you have to put them in the worst possible situation to strip back all of their bullshit and find out who they are as core people. And I enjoy doing that. I enjoy peeling back those layers and saying, this is who you are at your fundamental level. This is who you are as a person, but you had to be put into extremis in order to discover that about yourself. I wouldn't recommend it for. Can
I go ahead and just really strongly disagree with that statement? That a person at the worst moment of their life is who they truly are. Like, I think that's nonsense. I think the idea that a person in their most extreme situation is who they really are at their depth of character is really degrading to humanity and really insulting to people and really something that, like, I hear over and over again. And it's not just you saying it. I've heard it so many times. But the idea that someone, in their most desperate circumstance that action defines their character more than any other action they've ever taken in their lives, to me is crazy talk. Just crazy talk.
Yeah. So I explained myself poorly. I meant what I meant is that each one of my characters embodies a particular trait. So it might be loyalty, it might be kindness, it might be selfishness. But what I meant was if by putting them into an extreme situation, you might discover which one of those traits is what forms the core of their personality. So if somebody decides to sacrifice themselves in an extreme situation, that is what their core personality says. Someone else might just be completely terrified and do whatever it takes to survive. That doesn't mean that they're a bad person. It just means that that is their driving motivation.
No, I completely agree.
As a character. As a character, that's fine, I think. I think if we're talking about verisimilitude, it's another issue.
Oh my God, no. No, not of an actual real person. But, you know, I think the way I write is each of my characters is built around a particular character trait. Because we can't make every single person completely three-dimensional. So I tend to use like traits as each person.
So I think that makes sense. Yeah.
Not real people. Oh my God, no.
If you put someone sort of completely through the shit, and then you can see how they react. Yeah, it's fun to play with the characters. I do the exact same thing with that, to be honest.
Yeah.
This has been great fun. Maybe the last one was too serious. Maybe I should have started with it so that we could just talk about swords or something lighthearted at the end. But as we are at 1 minute 22, I'm going to ask each of you to talk about your latest book. Doesn't have to include about writing the fight scene. Just plug your latest book and tell us where you're going. And this time, I think I'm going to start with Anna, whether that's fair or not.
Okay. I suppose the last one that has been published is The Serpent and the Dead, which is my first Marvel prose novel, which is following Lady Sif and Brunhild the Valkyrie as they try to uncover a mystery of why the souls of the honored dead are not going to Valhalla, but are instead being stolen for some nefarious purpose. So it is a high adventure. It's full of magic. It's full of extremely competent females doing extremely competent things. And there are some kind of zombie-like creatures that get hacked into many little pieces. And yeah, it is a rip-roaring adventure in the style of a Marvel.
Sebastien.
So the latest books are Way of the Argosy and Fall of the Argosy, which have a certain amount of swashbuckling fun in them. Swashbuckling is kind of mostly my zone. But again, if you want lots of sword fights, Tales of the Greatcoats kind of has it. And because in a way, a lot of those stories were me sort of going, I wonder how someone would survive this in a duel. Including there's a story in there about a wheelwright, a sort of middle-aged woman who is suddenly forced into a judicial duel. And one of the characters from the Greatcoats, Cast, who's sort of one of the great sword fighters of all time, has basically 5 minutes to try to tell her how to defeat this person, who in every way, shape, and form appears to be her superior. And so, and that, I think, just to round the fighting stuff, sword fighting stuff, that is often what you're doing when you're writing sword fights, is going, how do I make this interesting by turning the fight by giving the fight at least some of the elements of a puzzle that the reader can follow along as the character is trying to solve.
Alina.
My latest book is Gifting Fire, and it's the sequel to Stealing Thunder, and it is fundamentally the story of how a transgender princess of the Mughal Empire is forced into an arranged marriage by her shitty father with her childhood rapist, and how she gets out of that. Yikes. So, yeah.
What are you writing now, Alina?
Lately, I've been finishing up a swashbuckling 18th century YA fantasy that is, YA, like historical fiction, that is Leah de Beaumont, the Chevalier Léon, the transgender woman spy of the 18th century. She kind of rewrote her own life history later in her life and made stuff up that it's taken historians centuries to decode. And I thought, wouldn't it be really funny as an homage to her to like write her teen years the way she wished they would have been. And so that's what I've done.
I'll buy that.
Yeah.
Lee.
Okay, so I've had a couple of cool short stories come out recently. But the last full-length novel that came out was A Ritual of Flesh, which is the sequel to my Dead Saga. It's book 2 in the Dead Sagas. I am currently writing A Ritual of Bone, and that's going to be the big news, hopefully, this year. But the last big thing is this one. So it is Norse-inspired, well, vaguely Norse-inspired fantasy horror, zombie apocalypse in a fantasy setting, basically. So if that sounds cool, you should totally check it out.
Well, I hope you guys have all had fun. And I look forward to seeing you all next year, except Sebastien. I think I'll see you tomorrow.
Possibly, but Christian, what about your latest book?
Yes.
Inquiring
Yeah,
minds
that's
want to
right.
know.
Oh, I write a bunch of books. I wrote Artifact Space. I don't have a copy handy because my friends have taken all my copies. It's a science fiction novel, and it's out now. And right now I'm writing Bronze Age fantasy. It's hard to encapsulate because I am literally trying to get inspired by everybody from Poche, Bronze Age, pre-Inca in South America, to my beloved Mycenaeans. And I was fascinated when Anna mentioned the Iliad, because I love the Iliad as literature, but to me, the Iliad inspired my Bronze Age novel because to me, it's hell. It's hell. Like,
Yeah.
except even for Achilles, it's actually in the end hell. It's not hell for
Especially.
everyone, especially for slaves and women. But in the end, for everyone, and the gods are horrible. And I went like, let's play this. It's not going to be Marvel Comics. Anyway.
Yeah. That sounds fun. Also, if you need any Moche books, I've got like 6 different Moche archaeology monographs on my shelf.
Dude, we'll talk.
Okay.
This has been super fun. See you guys around.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Nice chatting with you.
Thank you, Mark.